In the summer of 1944, the United States Pacific Fleet was headed for the Mariana Islands. U.S. forces reached Saipan on June 15th. After a hard-fought amphibious landing on the tropical beaches, the Marines advanced inland, waging protracted battles kilometer after kilometer because the defenders had fortified the island extremely well.
In
1944, Pacific Islands, like the Mariana Islands, were bitterly contested and fiercely fought over because Japanese officers were ordered to halt the Mariana Islands to the last man and to the last bullet. Because it was quite clear to the Japanese military leadership that from the Mariana, American bombers would be able to reach the Japanese mother islands and would be able to bomb Tokyo as well.
During the war against Japan, U.S. forces combined two thrusts. One was via New Guinea and the Philippines, the other via the Central Pacific.
The decisive thrust of the war was in the Central Pacific because the Central Pacific divides the Japanese sphere of power into a northern and southern half, and because from the Central Pacific, from the Marianas, American B-29s could bomb Japan.
The images of the bloody amphibious landings were similar to those taken a few days earlier in Europe. The Normandy invasion began on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of France. Here, as there, the Allies threw incredible quantities of men and material into battle, but that's where the parallels between the two theaters of war ended.
It was really a global war, which also had very different reasons, a different course, but each with its own logic. The Pacific War was not just an offshoot of Europe, it had its own value, a war of its own logic. And then there was this parallelism. It was quite remarkable what was achieved logistically.
12,000 defenders had entrenched themselves on Saipan. After the Japanese fleet was crushed in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they were cut off from all supplies. The Japanese soldiers were hiding in the jungle and in extensive cave systems.
Japanese war propaganda quite strongly fueled the will on the part of Japanese soldiers to really fight to the death, to hold on to these small and seemingly insignificant islands.
The
Japanese demanded the utmost from their opponents. In accordance with the Bushido Code, they didn't give an inch. To force the defenders out of their cave systems, the American soldiers perfected their flamethrower tactics. They attacked the caves in groups, supported by artillery and machine guns. Japanese who rushed out of their caves on fire were gunned down by the GIs. The slaughter lasted 3 weeks. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. The Marines' prisoners were almost exclusively Korean forced laborers.
And then they entered an area with the Japanese civilian population for the first time. Before that, you were only in the outposts. In Saipan, the Japanese had massive casualties. They performed these banzai attacks, where they were being mowed down by the hundreds and thousands. And it was compounded by the fact that, whether voluntarily or force, probably more by force, the Japanese civilian population was also jumping off cliffs. This led the Americans to wonder what if even the Japanese civilian population wouldn't surrender, how was the war going to end? We were to have them kill every Japanese person, one by one, and we might be able to do that. But that also meant there could be enormous casualties on our side.
By the end of the Battle of Saipan, some 26,000 Japanese Army soldiers and about 3,500 U.S. Marines had lost their lives. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin was making plans for the further course of his offensive against the Third Reich. The Red Army had been advancing successfully since June 22, 1944, which was the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Within 5 weeks, they had advanced as far as Poland. As Soviet troops approached Warsaw, Stalin seized the opportunity to extend his claim to rule Poland. While the Red Army advanced to the Vistula, the Polish underground resistance finally tried to strike against the Germans. The Polish Home Army had set itself the goal of liberating the country and saw the time had come to act.
The Poles were, of course, massively anti-German, anti-Nazi, but probably anti-Soviet to a similar degree. The question now was, it's of no use to us if we get rid of German rule and then come under Soviet rule. And that's why they thought, if we liberate Warsaw, liberate our capital on our own before the Soviets arrive, that would give us political weight in shaping post-war Poland.
On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, dared to revolt in Warsaw. 45,000 men were ready, but many of them were inadequately armed or not armed at all. The insurgents completely lacked any sort of heavy weaponry. The German Wehrmacht brutally put down the uprising.
As always, the Germans reacted extremely quickly in such situations. They brought in troops from everywhere and fought that uprising with the most brutal force. And the Armia Krajowa couldn't do anything but try to go down heroically and fight against the Germans. And it was clear relatively quickly by the first days of August that they didn't stand a chance against these Germans who were bringing in troops on a massive scale.
Der letzte Widerstand der Aufständischen in Warschau ist endgültig unter der Wucht der deutschen Waffen zusammengebrochen. Schlachtflieger vernichten einen Häuserblock, der eines der stärksten Widerstandsnester barg.
An inferno broke out over Warsaw.
The Germans were using this to actually wipe out this Warsaw. That's why they were fighting not only militarily against the Polish Home Army, but especially in those first days of August, the concept was to put down this uprising with brutal force in order to punish the Polish civilian population at the same time. So there were hundreds of thousands of dead in that struggle. It was a zenith of violence, a zenith of terror that Poland was experiencing there from the Germans.
Stalin did nothing to save Warsaw. He planned to secure his power in Poland by means of a puppet government.
Stalin ordered the Red Army to wait until the Germans had finished the job. It was clear to him that after the war there would be no independent nationalist Poland, because he knew that the Polish nationalists were the worst enemies of the Bolsheviks, and he didn't want to see anyone from this force in the Polish government. And therefore, he quite cynically let the Germans do the bloody work, which he then didn't have to do. And the Red Army only marched into Warsaw when that fight was over.
SS Chief Himmler ordered all inhabitants of Warsaw to be killed and the city razed to the ground. The slaughter lasted 63 days. No one knows the exact number of victims. Among Polish civilians alone, the figures vary between 150 and 225,000 dead. The West played along with Stalin's game. In October of 1944, Winston Churchill traveled to Moscow. Together with Stalin, the British Prime Minister drafted a plan for the division of Eastern Europe after the war.
Famously infamous was the so-called note on which was noted in handwriting into which spheres of influence the eastern territories of Europe should fall. The Baltic states and Poland were to be completely under the influence of the Soviet Union. Romania, to a large extent, to the Soviet Union. Bulgaria likewise. Yugoslavia, 50% to the Soviet Union and 50% under Western influence. It is rumored that Churchill wrote the note and Stalin checked off each point noted on it. The note has generally been regarded as a rather cynical expression of great power behavior that decided the post-war fate over the heads of millions of people.
On their retreat, the Wehrmacht left behind scorched earth, the order, which officially read loosening, clearing, paralysis, and destruction, resulted in the Germans devastating entire areas. Supplies were destroyed, machinery destroyed, towns and villages burned down, people deported. The marauding soldiers soon became almost unstoppable.
What actually happened then was basically an unprecedented program of destruction. Everything of value was destroyed. There was, just to give you one example, this infamous rail wolf that ripped up all the rail ties. Dams were being blown up. There was a really huge plain that a lot of times the only thing left standing were chimneys. Villages of chimneys made of bricks, and those chimneys were still sticking up in the air and everything else was just flattened.
While the Wehrmacht was devastating entire regions in the east, the Germans on the home front hoped for the promised miracle weapons to bring the wartime enemy in the British Isles to their knees. In the propaganda jargon of the Third Reich, the rockets developed by Werner von Braun were called V2s. V stood for retaliation. Tests failed time and again. Now the V2, together with the V1 cruise missile, was supposed to turn the tide and, at Adolf Hitler's behest, wipe out cities in Great Britain.
Technically, the V2 was actually a very modern device, which initiated the development of the moon rocket. But it was wonderful for the Allies that the Germans built it, because it was so infinitely expensive and so infinitely complex. If the Germans had built conventional weapons, airplanes, tanks, they could have done much more damage with it. The effect militarily was almost zero. They killed a few thousand civilians, but that was it.
On September 8, 1944, the first launch was successful. By the end of the war, 1,400 V2 rockets had been fired, mainly from mobile launch pads in Holland. The V2 was so fast that British anti-aircraft systems failed. Without warning, the rockets hit residential neighborhoods whose residents couldn't get to safety in time. In London, thousands died. Another prestige object of the Nazis was the newly developed Me-262 jet fighter, which was produced at enormous cost in terms of material. The aircraft, which could reach speeds of up to 900 kilometers per hour, was intended to put an end to Allied air supremacy. However, the first jets weren't ready for operation until November of 1944. Due to the lack of fuel, the fighters could only rarely take off. In the end, the Me-262 was unable to break the superiority of the enemy air force.
The Messerschmitt 262 was a revolutionary aircraft, clearly ahead of its time. But no airplane decides a war. When we examine air warfare, we find time and again that technology is not actually decisive. That depends on tactics, and above all, on numbers. And of course, the maximum 200 jet fighters would not have any significant effect at all. On the contrary, they shot down some bombers, but lost just as many of their own fighters. So that fizzled out and was mainly a means of propaganda. The Germans had tactical weapons, so they were almost always superior to their opponents. The Germans undoubtedly had the best tanks, and according to Allied statements, the Germans had excellent infantry weapons, the MG-42, the assault rifle 44. The Germans really made superior tactical weapons, but the strategic weapons, strategic bombers or something like that, in all these things the Germans were inferior because they neglected that.
The battle for the Japanese-occupied Philippines had been raging in the Gulf of Leyte since October of 1944. Island by island, U.S. troops had pushed Japan's soldiers back across the Pacific. The largest naval battle in history ended in favor of the Americans. Ever since he retreated from the Japanese with his troops in December of 1941, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur had declared that the recapture of the Philippines was a personal matter.
Douglas MacArthur
was a man who came from a very traditional military family, and for family reasons, he also felt very connected to the Philippines. His father, for example, had also already served in the Philippines. His failure to hold and defend the Philippines was a very great shock for him. He made a promise when he left the Philippines, and he wanted to keep that promise. At the time, he said, "I'll be back." Very much like the Terminator, "I'll be back." That's what it was all about for him. And for him, the reconquest of the Philippines was above all symbolic, a personal, symbolic value.
During the Battle of Leyte, Japanese squads known as Kamikaze planes were used for the first time. Japanese pilots deliberately flew their aircraft into American warships. While the phenomenon did not decisively weaken U.S. forces during those war years, it exposed soldiers and sailors to extraordinary nervous strain. On the western border of the Third Reich, the so-called West Wall was unable to stop the Allied forces. The troops' goal was the Rhine. During their advance, however, the U.S. soldiers encountered unexpectedly strong resistance. In the forests near Aachen, they engaged in fierce battles with German Wehrmacht units. Supplies, which had to be brought in from southern France and Normandy, also came to a standstill.
They could take some German villages, but there they were stuck because they ran out of gas. That's where the priorities were misplaced and the Germans could reorganize themselves.
But the Germans were not as well prepared as the newsreel would have you believe.
Vom Kampf im Westen. Auf den westlichen Schlachtfeldern geht die Rechnung der Feinde nicht auf. Sie glaubten, bei Erreichung der deutschen Grenzen würde Deutschland zusammenbrechen. Das Gegenteil ist der Fall. Deutsche Reserven marschieren an. Mit allen Waffen ausgerüstet beziehen sie ihre Standorte.
Although the war was clearly lost by the summer of 1944 at the latest, the Wehrmacht continued to fight. They didn't want to endure another 1918, no defeat, where it could be said that we surrendered too soon. What the soldiers had in mind this time was that it was better to surrender 5 minutes after 12 than 5 minutes before 12. All of this, of course, with horrendous losses, which far exceeded anything we had seen before.
On October 12th, U.S. troops attacked Aachen. 4 days later, they closed the ring around the city. Hitler demanded that the imperial city was to be defended to the last drop of blood. About 3,000 men followed his orders, among them numerous SS men and volunteers from the Hitler Youth. They initiated a house-to-house battle with heavy losses. On October 21st, the German commander finally surrendered officially. Anyone who wanted to surrender before then, despite the hopeless situation, had to expect to be fanatically persecuted.
Anyone who hung a white cloth out of the window and wanted to surrender, Aachen was one of the first cities to be liberated, was then considered a defeatist, or could be murdered. The SS also now turned on its own population. The desertion of soldiers was pursued more intensely than before, so order collapsed on the one hand in the Reich, and violence struck back at the Germans from the outside. But the Nazis, so to speak, beat their fellow Germans to persevere.
Diese Männer haben 50 Mal im Nahkampf mit dem Feind gestanden. Jetzt erhalten sie vom Führer die goldene Nahkampfspange. Mal sahen sie das Weiße im Auge des Gegners und bezwangen ihn mit der blanken Waffe. Wer will mit Worten sagen, was das bedeutet?
Even without words, it becomes clear that Germans still saw an encounter with Adolf Hitler as an honor, and the newsreel was supposed to motivate them to persevere with such grotesque propaganda campaigns. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels mobilized the remnants of the German population for a march to destruction. The staging of the so-called Volkssturm was intended to demonstrate the invincibility of the Reich.
Eurem Volke der ganzen Welt zu beweisen, dass Deutschland nicht nur an der Front, sondern auch in der Heimat über Millionen wehrbereiter, wehrentschlossener Männer verfügt, die den festen und unerschütterlichen Willen haben, niemals vor den Feinden des Reiches die Flagge zu streichen und feige zu kapitulieren.
The Volkssturm was the very last contingent, and everyone, at least that was the idea, all 16 to 60-year-olds were mobilized, mostly equipped with looted weapons or not at all. But as the war progressed, however, these Volkssturm battalions were increasingly deployed to the front line, and that deployment was, of course, completely pointless.
Und dieser Einsatz ist natürlich völlig sinnlos.
The war in the air also took on new dimensions. No longer were only large cities bombed, but medium-sized cities with industrial sites as well. To defend themselves, the Germans were forced to withdraw their air forces from other fronts. Although militarily effective, the usefulness of the devastating air war is still being disputed to this day.
In my opinion, it shortened the war considerably, because the Germans were forced to invest the majority of their armament resources into the air war to protect the Reich. They actually hoped to achieve two goals with the bombings, namely to break the morale of the general population, but that didn't succeed, and to paralyze arms production, which basically succeeded only very late, and as we know, not as much through the direct destruction of the production facilities, but the more effective thing was the destruction of the logistics system, that is, the infrastructure, the railroad facilities. That's what brought production to a standstill.
Das ist sozusagen das, was dann tatsächlich die Produktion zum Erliegen gebracht hat.
A destroyed production hall of Daimler Works. During the war, the company had mostly built trucks and aircraft engines. However, as before, not only industrial sites, but also civilian targets were bombed, which by the fall of 1944 seemed at least questionable from a moral point of view.
One could argue that the war was actually decided in September of 44. It was just a matter of time. Yes, that's right. But the war had yet to be won, and the British and Americans weren't on the Rhine yet. And they had a lot of respect for the Rhine and a lot of respect for the Germans. And the question was, of course we're going to win the war, but at what price? And when will this shitty war finally be over? Because there was war fatigue, and to end the war, we had to hit it hard.
The British, in particular, bombed civilian targets in the Reich. Bombs were loaded on bases in England almost daily. These included 4,000-pound blockbusters that would detonate while still in the air, covering as many house roofs as possible and paving the way for incendiary bombs.
Because the British still had the idea that if they kept burning down the inner cities, then the Germans would somehow give up, and the British further wars, further advances, further fighting on land. And that then led to the fact that the British were particularly successful in destroying cities, and those incendiary attacks that they flew also took a particularly large number of human lives. It was certainly the most radical form of warfare against the German civilian population.
About 600,000 German civilians fell victim to the Allied bombing war. In light of such numbers, it was difficult to understand why the Germans continued to support the criminal Nazi regime.
Towards the end, fear really prevailed more and more. As you hear from personal testimonies, we had to win the war, because with what we had done, if we lose, we don't even want to imagine what they will do to us. That created a great will to persevere. even after the sometimes terrible bombardments by the Allies, which were aimed at breaking the will of the population to persevere. That simply didn't happen, because this total dictatorship of National Socialism still worked so well in capturing large parts of the population that the distribution of goods, of services, still reached the people.
The Nazi regime not only had to ensure the survival of the population, but it also had to maintain the production of armaments, which was necessary for the war. In order to escape the increasingly precise attacks by the British and Americans, production facilities were moved underground throughout the Reich.
One response to the air war was to say we're now moving what we consider to be the most important and central production areas to bomb-proof underground production facilities.
In bombensichere Untertage-Produktionsanlagen.
The factories were put in mines, tunnels, and underground galleries.
Die Absicht der Feinde, durch planmäßigen und massierten Bombenwurf die deutsche Rüstung zu zerschlagen, ist gescheitert. Rechtzeitig und mit deutscher Gründlichkeit wurden kriegsentscheidende Fertigungen unter die Erde verlagert.
New tunnels were also built for some of the underground production facilities. The newsreel does not reveal that mostly forced laborers and concentration camp inmates were used for the construction and operation of these facilities in order to carry out the dangerous work.
That was a big program that was set up there, which again entailed a change in the character of forced labor, because concentration camp inmates were systematically used in those underground relocation projects, and that was where the most deadly working conditions for forced laborers prevailed.
When U.S. troops reached the Mittelwerk manufacturing plant in the Harz Mountains in April of 1945, they found the remains of one of these terrible factories. Prisoners from the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp had to build the engines for the V-2 here. The labor camp only operated for 18 months. But the inhumane conditions cost the lives of 20,000 people. All the GIs found were a few completely exhausted prisoners.
There, above all, Jewish concentration camp prisoners, or concentration camp prisoners in general, were used because it was very dangerous. The work was very dangerous, but it was also detrimental to their health. And it was the kind of work that was expected from those in whose survival they had no interest in anyway, and where the term extermination through labor absolutely summed up the situation.
Vernichtung durch Arbeit ja schon die Situation absolut auf den Punkt bringt.
Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were forced to slave away on large construction sites and in factories throughout the Reich. The prisoners were kept alive only as long as they were able to work. Those who became weak and sick were left to their fate or sent to the gas chamber. The Minister of Armaments, who was responsible for using the now 7 million forced laborers, was Albert Speer. He would visit the deployment area of the latest Wehrmacht offensive. He wanted to follow the battle personally. Adolf Hitler planned to overrun the Allies in the Ardennes. All reserves still available were mobilized for this purpose. The decision was to be made in the hilly forests of the Ardennes. The Nazi leadership concentrated hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers in the border area between the German Reich, Belgium, and France.
The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's attempt to turn the war once again, to give it a military twist. He really believed the Western Allies were at the weakest point in this opposing alliance. And if you beat them, so to speak, as you did in 1940, then possibly the whole Western Front would collapse. The Western Allies would withdraw, and then only the Soviet Union would be left. And then, so to speak, the German war machine could focus its full power once again on the Eastern Front.
The U.S. forces had been trying to advance toward the Rhine for weeks. In the Hürtgen forest between Aachen and Düren, they had unexpectedly suffered heavy losses. On December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht offensive Operation Autumn Fog began. At 5:30 in the morning, the German artillery opened fire. 20 divisions were ready to attack.
The Allies were taken completely by surprise by the German offensive. They hadn't expected the Germans to be able to pull together so many tanks and troops. But unlike in 1940, now there were Allied troops in the Ardennes. In 1940, no one was there, and they just marched through. Now there were troops there, and they were fighting too.
If we do not succeed, Adolf Hitler declared at a briefing, I don't see any chance of a favorable outcome to this war, but we will get through. The deluded dictator still failed to recognize the sheer superiority of his opponents. But for the U.S. troops, the offensive was much harder to repel than expected. In the battle that is now known in U.S. military history as the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans inflicted heavy casualties on them.
For the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge was a very significant experience, because American troops for the first time actually experienced what land warfare had meant in Europe during the previous wars. Wars under terrible weather conditions and wars in difficult terrain. And of course, these are all the reasons that contributed to this myth. It was also the bloodiest land battle fought by the U.S. Army during World War II. About 19,000 soldiers were killed during that period.
At first, the Germans had the element of surprise on their side. Entire units with thousands of soldiers fell into their hands, as the newsreel reported triumphantly.
Immer wieder das gleiche Bild. Vorgehende deutsche Kolonnen, Gefechtsfahrzeuge, Nachschub, Trosse auf der einen Seite und Dreierkolonnen marschierender weißer und schwarzer Amerikaner auf der anderen Seite.
With racist condescension, Nazi propaganda tried to cover up the hopelessness of the Wehrmacht's military situation. The plan to crush the Allies no longer had much to do with reality.
The idea that this plan was based on was that you had to get your fuel from the American depots. And that was, of course, a plan that was based on so many intangibles that the German divisions, there were a lot of SS divisions involved, so it was really again what the Reich was somehow able to scrape together, including weapons. The Germans then managed to advance about 100 kilometers into Belgian territory.
Den Deutschen gelingt es dann, etwa 100 Kilometer auf belgisches Gebiet vorzustoßen.
The element of surprise fizzled out very quickly. You also couldn't use an initial shock to advance quickly enough to create reality. And in certain parts of the front, the attack failed completely. It all went completely wrong, especially with the Waffen-SS. And then there's also the fact that anyone who had ever been to the Ardennes could see for himself that it wasn't the ideal area for a 60-ton tank. The army that marched through there in 1940 marched through with light tanks, with light trucks. And now the army of 1944 was marching through there, which was equipped completely differently and which wasn't suitable for these mountain roads.
The Allies reacted quickly and were therefore able to hold their key positions. Reserves and supplies arrived quickly. Even the bad weather couldn't save the Wehrmacht. Its units suffered massive losses. After 2 weeks, the Germans found themselves on the defensive.
Then the Americans counterattacked, and by the end of January, basically everything was back to the way it was at the beginning. The German-American front was restored.
During Christmas week 1944, the Allies seized the military initiative again. In the evacuated town of Eschweiler, American GIs celebrated Christmas, the last one of this war. In a few weeks, the German offensive would collapse. On the home front, the Germans also celebrated the holidays, which was staged for the newsreel in line with propaganda. At the same time, their fathers, brothers, and sons were facing Soviet superiority in Hungary. On December 25th, the ring around German troops in Budapest closed. The Red Army set out to conquer Hungary's capital. Germany's former allies were now to be liberated. As early as the spring of 1944, the alliance between Hungary and the Third Reich had become fragile.
Hungary had been an ally of Nazi Germany since 1941. When the military defeat of Nazi Germany became apparent, Hungary launched its first attempts to reorient itself and established contact with the Allies.
Hitler then immediately summoned the Reich Regent Miklos Horthy to Berlin for a report. While the dictator was pressuring him with one of his tantrums, German troops marched into Hungary. When Horthy returned, the country was occupied. The Nazis began deporting the Jewish population to Auschwitz.
Starting on March 19, 1944, German troops entered Hungary completely unexpectedly and without a fight took power there. Of course, the old Hungarian government was still there. The Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy was still there. But he didn't really have that much to say anymore. All the power was in the hands of the German representatives. There was a Reich plenipotentiary, that's what he called himself, and there was also, of course, a so-called special task force that was set up specifically to deal with the Jews.
Das Schlimme ist ja, dass die Deutschen zu diesem Zeitpunkt schon eine...
The bad thing was, after all, that the Germans already had a lot of experience in murder. This special task force under Eichmann initially began to empty the country, and by the summer of 1944, they deported about 430,000 people to Auschwitz. There it was. 2/3 went immediately to the gas chamber, and 1/3 remained. They did forced labor, and most of them still died there, so it was a terrible situation. And of course, it was one of the last brutal highlights of the Holocaust. It was also referred to as the final chapter.
Des Holocaust, also es wurde auch als das letzte Kapitel bezeichnet.
In January of 1945, the Red Army, under the command of Marshal Ivan Konev, advanced towards Breslau and Krakow without encountering any significant resistance. In the face of imminent defeat, the German occupiers began to cover up their crimes with murderous thoroughness. This was also the case at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp complex.
Als die sowjetische Armee näher rückte, hat die SS den...
As the Soviet army approached, the SS cleared most of the camps, and the detainees went on so-called death marches. Attempts were made to bring them on foot to the Altreich in order to cover their tracks.
Des Altreichs zu bringen, eben Spuren zu verwischen.
However, most of the people who were sent on these marches were no longer physically able, so the marches basically meant death marches, because a large proportion of those who were sent on those marches simply perished.
Prozentteil derjenigen, die dort auf die Fußmärsche geschickt wurden, einfach umgekommen sind.
Heinrich Himmler was responsible for the evacuation of the concentration camps. The SS Reichsführer instructed his troops to systematically destroy all evidence of the regime's mass murders before it fell into Allied hands.
There was this infamous Sonderkommando 1005. They started digging all these mass graves in 1943 and burning the dead. And that's what they did in the middle of the whole extermination program. That's what they did in Auschwitz, with a certain amount of success. Files were destroyed, the crematoria were dismantled, the gas chambers were blown up.
When the first units of the Red Army reached the concentration camp on January 27, 1945, most of the barracks were empty. The soldiers found only a few prisoners left who could bear witness to the horrors that took place there.
I think there were 6,000 to 7,000 prisoners that the Red Army found there, completely exhausted. Of course, they tried to help those people immediately, But it's also a well-known phenomenon among people who have been starved very badly that they actually die the moment they get something to eat. And that's exactly what happened there. And another 20% of those people died in the following weeks.
The liberated also spoke of the gas chambers where up to 10,000 people were murdered every day.
What was new about Auschwitz was the dimension of the whole thing. That is, it is now assumed that about 1.3 million people were killed there. And that was new. And of course, it had a corresponding effect. Anyone who has been to Auschwitz knows that much more has been preserved than the perpetrators would have liked. The glasses, the hair, the suitcases, everything is still there. And that actually left no doubt as to what actually happened there.
Es ließ eigentlich keinen Zweifel daran, was da eigentlich passiert ist.
Auschwitz-Birkenau has become a symbol of the worst mass crime in history. The survivors described the selections at the ramp, the hunger, the torture, the human experiments. In the face of this kind of horror, mankind is still searching for explanations today.
Talk of a relapse into barbarism is nonsense. I believe the opposite is the case. Modern states have many more possibilities to move people away. Sophisticated transportation systems, railroad cars that quickly be used to move hundreds of thousands of people. Airplanes and bombs that completely wipe out cities in a few days. The technical possibilities of the modern state are so great that if a dictator makes use of them, he can quickly implement very large killing programs. Modernity has not only increased the possibilities, it has introduced the division of labor, in which everyone is a small cog in the wheel and can say, yes, I signed some files, I put together the trains, but I didn't do it myself. That has a relieving effect. It's a process of civilization that paradoxically made it possible for this monstrous murder program to be born.
Some children survived the horror. They willingly showed the tattoos on their arms that identified them as victims of the National Socialist racial fanaticism. They, too, will describe the unimaginable, which at first many Germans refused to believe. But the genocide of 6 million Jews is a bitter truth.